Good morning. It felt a little strange to be kind of dancing to happy music because we've got a pretty serious topic this morning. Welcome to North Carolina Health News's Healthcare Half Hour. It's a monthly conversation that we have with people that we are talking to around the state about pressing healthcare issues. And today we're going to be talking to a friend of North Carolina Health News's. Actually, she's somebody who's on our board, Phoebe Zerwick. And she's recently published this incredible book, Beyond Innocence, the life sentence of Darryl Hunt. It's a story about Darryl Hunt, who was wrongfully accused of a crime in the 1980s and served 2 decades in prison before being found innocent and exonerated. Phoebe is a journalist. She spent most of her career at the Winston-Salem Journal, most of her writing career. She's now at Wake Forest University, where she heads up the journalism program there. And she was pretty intimately involved near the end with the Hunt case. When she was at the Winston-Salem Journal, she wrote a series of articles that re-examined his case. And not long after, the case was heard again in court, and he was found innocent and exonerated. So we're going to have, one of the things that we're going to talk about today is we're really going to focus in on the mental health aspects of this entire episode, and really looking at mental health and in the prison system in North Carolina and the U.S. And Phoebe's book does a beautiful job of laying out how Darryl Hunt was affected psychologically by this entire episode. So I just want to remind folks that North Carolina Health News is a not-for-profit news website. We provide all of our stories for free, and we are powered by donations from readers and foundations and organizations that believe in our work. So please feel free to support us. And with that, I'm going to introduce Phoebe Zerwick and ask you to start, Phoebe, by good morning, first off.
Good morning.
I'm going to ask you to start off now. You could spend a half hour just talking about the Darryl Hunt case and all the twists and turns it took. But can you give us kind of a thumbnail timeline for the folks who are not as familiar with the case of what happened and how it played out?
Sure. And I'm going to zip through this as best as I can so we can get to the meat of the conversation. And thank you, everyone, for being here. And thank you, Rose. So the short version of this very long and twisted up tale is that in the summer of 1984, Darryl Hunt was 19 years old, and he'd been orphaned, and he was looking for a job, and he was kind of staying with a friend and hanging out and trying to get a job, trying to get on with the city streets department where his grandfather had worked. And there was a terrible crime in downtown Winston-Salem. It was the rape and murder of a newspaper editor at the afternoon newspaper. And the police very quickly zeroed in on him because of a 911 call that used his friend Sammy Mitchell's name. And he was very quickly, Darryl Hunt was very quickly arrested and charged with this crime. And of course, the crime itself had really inflamed the public. It was the rape and murder of a white woman, and witnesses had seen her with a black man. So of course, it brought up all of these old racist tropes that have been part of our history since our country began. And there was tremendous pressure to solve the case. And so he was arrested, and then in the spring of 1985, he was convicted. He was spared the death penalty by two votes on the jury, and he was sent off to prison, to some of the worst prisons in our state. And then in 1986, The police were trying to solve some unsolved murders in Winston-Salem, and he and his friend Sammy Mitchell were charged with the death of an older man who died outside of a liquor house. And it's not even clear that that was in fact a murder, but they were charged with that and convicted. Then both of these convictions were overturned, and Darryl Hunt was tried again. He was acquitted of that other murder, but convicted once again in the death and in the murder of Deborah Sykes. And then he spent 12, 13 years appealing that conviction. So in 1994, there was DNA evidence that should have cleared him of the crime. The DNA evidence showed that he was not the rapist in the case, but every court kind of poo-pooed that DNA evidence. So he went through 10 years of rejection from every appellate court in the country. And then finally in 2003, there was a new round of DNA testing. And by then we had databases of convicted offenders. And so the real killer and rapist was identified, and Darryl Hunt was exonerated in 2004. Other key moments in 2008, the city re-examined the case and established that he had in fact it been railroaded. So it was not incompetence that led to his conviction, but there was intent. And so he won over $1.5 million from the city in a settlement, which, you know, secured him financially. He also became an advocate for social justice. A lot of the reforms we have in North Carolina are due to him, including the Innocence Inquiry Commission, which is the only judicial body of its kind that actually will investigate and hear claims of innocence. So that is a really important part of his legacy. And he also set up a foundation in Winston-Salem to work with people coming home from prison. So not exonerees, but just people in general coming home from prison. But then as the book describes, and really what we're going to be talking about today is the trauma, the damage of both the prison system and our legal system caught up with him. And in 2016, he was found dead in a borrowed pickup truck in Winston-Salem, and the death was ruled a suicide. He had a gunshot wound to the belly. So that's the quick version of this very long tale.
Right. You really have done a job. You spent a couple hundred pages and you've boiled it down. So, and, you know, just before we really get into the meat of this, you know, I want to also say that when you were at the Winston-Salem Journal in 2003, and you were given the opportunity to review this again, talk to me about like the process that took place. Like, how long did you get to look at this story?
Oh, yeah, this is a really important question, because in 2003, of course, journalism, newspapers were way healthier and pretty well funded, and we had a lot of people in the newsroom. So in 2003, he filed a motion to get the evidence retested for DNA. And we had new editors at the paper by then, and I was a local news columnist, but they took me off my local news column and said, "Oh, spend a few weeks looking into this." Well, those weeks turned into 6 or 7 months. So I was given that time to exclusively work on looking into this case. You know, there were thousands of pages of court documents and police reports, dozens of people to interview, probably at least 100 people. You know, plenty of time to write it. They also freed up the city editor for at least a month. It was probably longer than that, to work exclusively with me on the drafting and the rewriting. At some point, they freed up a copy editor to work exclusively on the layout and the headlines. They also freed up, we had an online editor, and they freed that person up to work on the multimedia online presentation. So there was a lot of time that went into this series of stories by really great people.
And I think about like the number of people that you had freed up to do this work just exclusively is about the same number of people that North Carolina Health News employs full time.
Exactly.
And so I think about the things that we've lost. And so when people ask me about like funding local journalism, I also tell them it's a justice issue. If there are not people looking at these cases, local journalists, it doesn't get done. So, I guess, like I said, that was a slightly self-serving question because I want to, reinforce to people the importance of the kind of work that gets done by journalists. And I think everyone here probably knows that, but, want to make the case. Just jumping finally into the meat of this, of this whole story, one of the things that is so extraordinary is that Darryl Hunt was 19 when he was first accused of this gruesome rape and murder. And, but you would think that he was encouraged to start keeping journals by one of his advocates. And so we have the benefit of all of these journals, and you can see, you have excerpts of the journals in the book, and you can see that he was really angry. But his outward demeanor was so, there was not a congruence between what he was obviously feeling inside and what he was expressing. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so one thing that always struck people who met Darryl Hunt from the time he was 19 years old was this kind of calm and dignity he had about him. And there's an incredible tape of the first interview that his lawyer, Mark Rabel, did with him when he was in jail awaiting trial. And, he talks about how he prays for justice and how he wants the right person to be charged with this. And Mark Rabel says, well, are you angry? And he says, no, I'm not angry. I just pray for justice. And then he says, what do you pray for yourself, Darryl? And he says, all I want is a decent life. So he had this kind of humble and graceful demeanor. But when I started working on the book and got access to some of his journals and letters, I learned that inside he was having, of course, all the reaction that would be expected if you were locked up and put away for something that you didn't do, and put away for something horrific. This was not a robbery gone bad. This was a brutal rape and stabbing death of a young woman. And so his journals, he is, he's pissed, but he never revealed that in public. One of the things that happened to him, for example, that scarred him forever was when he was arrested and charged. The warrants office was in the basement of, I think, of City Hall then, and they had, of course, this was a high-profile crime, so they called all the news reporters and TV reporters and everybody for the perp walk to come and see this guy who they were charging with this horrible rape and murder. And they had this kind of cell in the warrants office. So basically, they had him in a cage, and all these people were there to look at him. The horrible rapist, murderer. And he didn't want to lose his cool. And so he found something to fix his gaze on, and he stared at, one of the reporters had these lime green socks, and he stared at those socks so that he could stay calm. And years later, after this whole ordeal was over and after he was exonerated, he was traveling with his attorney, Mark Rabel, doing advocacy work, and they were sitting in a hotel lobby, and suddenly Darryl Hunt, he breaks into a cold sweat, and his attorney looks at him and says, and it sort of goes away, and he said, what happened? And Darryl Hunt says, well, I can't breathe, my heart is racing. But you see that light over there, and there was some like neon lights in this hotel lobby. He said that lime green light, it was the same color as the socks that I stared at when I was first arrested.
This is more than 20 years later.
More than 20 years later. So he was never diagnosed with PTSD, but clearly he was having a flashback and a panic attack. That's what happened. But he didn't reveal that. And he even wrote about that he wasn't going to do anything while he was in jail to confirm the biases that white people had about young black man, that, you know, that he was out of control or angry or crazed. So he always kept this calm demeanor about him.
Mm-hmm. You know, you say that this was a horrific crime, but the other thing that was horrific were the conditions that he was imprisoned under. You talk about them, you start about halfway through the book, you start talking about things, you know, talk about places like Polk and Caledonia.
So, yeah, this comes out in the journals, in his journals too. Of course, he spent close to a year awaiting trial in the jail in Forsyth County. And that in itself was pretty terrible, because the first few weeks he was in that jail, there was a first floor corridor where they had cells at the back of the corridor. And he was really afraid to be there. He'd been in jail in Forsyth County before, but always in the more open unit where he knew people. And they put him in this dark, at the end of this corridor. And the rumor was that that's where they would put people to beat the heck out of them. And his first night after being charged with this crime, the shift changed, and these two officers came down who were rumored to be in the Ku Klux Klan. And he was really terrified. And they didn't attack him, but they said, kind of, you know, leeringly, well, the last N-word we had in here, we found hanging from that bar right up there. So from his first night in jail, incarcerated on this crime, there were threats and against his life and other kinds of threats. So when he went off to prison, the first place he was sent was a place called Polk, which is in Raleigh, kind of near where the art museum now is. And it was, for reasons that I never totally nailed down, the theory at the time was it was a good idea to put all the young male inmates in the same prison. So it was for 18 to 21-year-olds. It was not a juvenile detention center, but it was for 18 to 21-year-olds. So that's where they processed male inmates and held them until they sent them off somewhere else. And most of the prisons in North Carolina are considered camps. They're not single cell dorms. They're open dorms with anywhere between 20 and 35 men now. At the time, it was more, because they had them in dorms with triple-decker bunks. And these dorms were considered so violent that the guards wouldn't go in those dorms after they locked all the men into these dorms. And so there were stories, I didn't hear about this from Darryl Hunt's journals, but I read about it. There were people would, you know, pull the sheet down. And then there would be beatings and sexual assaults behind the sheet so that the guards couldn't even see in. So those were the conditions. There was the year he was imprisoned, there was a civil rights lawsuit that was filed that dragged on for years and years and years over the conditions in North Carolina prison camps.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to cut you short, Phoebe.
Please do.
Because one of the things that, like, you know, so he was in these camps, but also almost for his safety, he got himself placed into solitary.
Yeah.
More than once. Like, talk about that.
Yeah. So he, at various times in these camps, there were, of course, they were violent, but he endured a specific form of violence because he was a Black man convicted of raping a white woman. So there were white supremacist inmates in these camps, and also some of the prison guards, of course, had it out for him. So he was moved to a prison in Caswell County, which is north of Greensboro, so has always been a Klan stronghold. And when he was there were death threats, and also the guards tried to set him up for being shot at. And so that was his first experience there. He would intentionally break some sort of minor rule, like not show up to his work on time, or, you know, get out of line, some super minor infraction. And he was sent to solitary there. And he would do that almost intentionally to get himself out of a dangerous situation. And over the years, he would be sent to solitary, sometimes intentionally. Later on, he was accused of being part of a group called the 5 Percenters, which he was not part of, but that got him sent to solitary. And solitary, sometimes they call it segregated housing, but basically you're locked up in a cell that measures about 8 by 10 feet. Your food gets delivered through a slot. They let you out for an hour a day to shower in another locked cell that's on the same hallway or corridor. And then you get to go outside, but you don't go outside on the main yard. You go outside in another cage. It looks like a dog run is the best way that I can describe it. So it even has a roof, you know, and all told, he was in solitary for probably about 4 years, not consecutively, but for, you know, a couple of months at a time.
And if I'm not mistaken, like international human rights folks basically consider solitary to be torture.
They do, and they consider it to be torture for good reason. I mean, we are social beings, so being isolated like that is damaging. And there have been studies since Darryl Hunt's time in prison that link, that show that solitary sets you up for a lifetime of mental health problems, puts people who've been in solitary are way more at risk for psychiatric disorders, substance abuse, and suicide. You
know, I think about then the layers of trauma that this man, right, that he experienced, the trauma of being wrongfully convicted, the trauma of fearing for his life and being hypervigilant all the time. And you do such a terrific job in the book of describing the level of hypervigilance that he had to maintain in order to stay alive in the prison system. Then on top of that, the solitary, and then on top of that, having his one appeal after another declined. You know, I think about like some of these passages from his journals are really striking. You know, he on page 122, you speak about Caswell, and this one letter that he wrote to his attorney, Mark Rabel, he writes, you know, I'm doing okay under the circumstances, which is extraordinary in its own way. He says, I'm still held hostage in Caswell. And whatever, God willing, I'll endure this injustice a little longer. One thing is for sure, I will not let them incarcerate my mind. Later in that, he calls it Caswell concentration camp. You know, he became like his early journals, you know, there were misspellings and what he became so eloquent at like when he wrote in his journals, he became so eloquent at expressing his frustration and then privately his agony, really, in these journals. They're heartbreaking. But what's incredible is that you talk about that after he was released, in some ways, for Hunt, coming home was harder. How was that the case?
Yeah, it's hard to imagine that, isn't it? That it would be, and this is what we think, especially with people who've been exonerated, but also with anybody coming home from prison, we think, oh, they've endured this terrible experience. Now they get to come home and start over again. And in Hunt's case, it appeared that things were going really well for him. He had married while he was in prison, so he came home to a wife who adored him. She had 3 children, so he stepped into being a stepdad immediately. So anybody who's been there knows that that's tough. But he also came home to a wide network of supporters. So a lot of people coming home from prison don't have any of this, right? And then he was given compensation by the state, and he had eventually the settlement from the city. So he had enough money to support himself with. But the demons of the past stayed with him. So one thing that we know from trauma research is that trauma hardwires your body to continually relive that trauma, right? It doesn't go away. And especially when you have what some people call cumulative trauma or complex PTSD. Now, again, he was never diagnosed with PTSD, but it's pretty clear that he had something like that. You don't become, it turns out, more resilient to trauma. Eventually, it catches up with you. And so that's what was happening to him. And some of the signs of this cumulative trauma that he'd experienced were, for example, that every day he would go to an ATM machine, and he did that so that he would have an alibi, a record of where he was. He would not go, he didn't like to sit in a restaurant unless his back was to the wall so that he could see everything around him. He had an incredible memory for faces. And this is something that people who worked with him in his advocacy work remarked on. He never forgot a face. Well, that's because he had to remember, he had to be very aware of his surroundings while he was in prison. And all those skills that protect you while you're in a dangerous situation. And the best analogy I know of is to soldiers coming home from war. All those skills that would protect you while you're facing constant danger in a prison situation are not useful in daily life. It's hard to maintain a relationship if you can't trust, if you're always looking over your shoulder, and he didn't sleep very well, and he had nightmares, and he had flashbacks. Like all of this hypervigilance is not useful in daily civilian life. And other people I've spoken to in researching this book have this same, other people who've been in prison have this same sense of hypervigilance. A good friend of his has a security system on his house, and he has it in part to protect his property, but mostly so that he will always have a record of when he's home, because the camera will record him coming into his home and leaving his home. And
that's Rashid. He also talked about how he continues to sleep with the lights on, because that was the safer thing to do. So Phoebe, we're at 9 o'clock.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
It goes super fast, right?
So much,
right? If it's okay with you, we'll stay a few extra minutes.
Absolutely.
And folks who need to leave can, but folks who want to stay, please do. Just want to remind you, you're with North Carolina Health News for our healthcare half hour, and want to make one more appeal for donations. And we are a not-for-profit, and we run on reader donations and foundation funding and sponsorship. So if you are empowered to do any of those things, please help support this kind of journalism that we do. It's interesting, even before his, again, going back to his journals, there's one point in time before he was released, in 1995, he wrote, at first look, we look fine. Inside, this crap eats you. You try to give people some understanding, but there's no words to express how you feel. And you talk about how he didn't sleep well. He had these flashbacks. He had nightmares. So in some senses, you can almost understand how he began to self-medicate.
Absolutely.
And that's part of what ended up happening. He started using substances again.
Yeah, he started using drugs, probably opioids and I think cocaine. And he even talked about it when his wife caught him. He talked about it as just trying to numb himself. And of course, studies show that solitary sets you up for drug abuse. And many people who have been exonerated end up abusing substances. So to me, there's no surprise there that after having endured that much trauma, that you would turn to something to ease the suffering,
to tamp things down.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I could totally, it's like you and I talked about this idea that, that people adopt behaviors that at the time, in one context, they're very adaptive. And then in another context, they become less adaptive,
Yes. Yeah, I love that.
And this behavior is part of what led to, things like his marriage essentially dissolving.
Yes. Yeah. His marriage collapsed, and which was a devastating experience for him. And also some of that played out in public because he was a public figure. The other kinds of difficulties he faced when he got home was that everybody knew that he'd won this $1.5 million settlement from the city. And so kind of everybody he'd known from before he went to prison, everybody, kind of wanted a piece of that. And everybody, he felt so betrayed by that, and felt so unable to trust who his real friends were and who was just friends with him because they either wanted some of his money or he was a celebrity too. So his friends tell me that, he kind of attracted women, he was attractive, but he had this kind of aura of celebrity about him. So people were like clinging to him and wanted to be around him, but it was really hard for him to separate, to figure out who he could trust, who were his real friends versus who were the people who just wanted something from him. And all of that was really, really devastating for him. And also what they say about, and people who've been in prison have told me this, he went to prison at 19. He kind of came out still somewhat a 19-year-old man. You don't have the time, you mature in prison in one way, but you haven't had the life experiences that all the other 40-year-olds out there have had. So that, you're not fully developed emotionally or fully mature when you go to prison at that young age. And I suppose what's really important to me to get across is that we imprison 2 million people in this country, and a lot are young people who are imprisoned at a young age and suffer this kind of mental health trauma. And of course, a lot of people are in prison who already have mental illness. I mean, that's the whole flip side of mental health in prison, that if you have mental illness, it sets you up for either being put in jail or committing a crime or confessing to a crime, or all the other reasons you can end up in prison. So the connection between our mental health system and our mental health crisis in this country and prison, they're like this.
And we do precious little real rehabilitation. It's really, our prison system is really about punishment.
Exactly.
And there is so little, real rehabilitation attempts at treatment. We've documented like that it takes court cases and advocacy to even get like the basics for people, right? Even though there's it's enshrined in the Constitution to not be subjected to cruel and unusual punishment, but this is the norm.
Exactly.
It sort of boggles the mind.
Isolation is legal, I think, in every state. And I'll just go back to isolation, which is that I think the public, and before I started looking at this, I certainly thought, oh, isolation is for really, really dangerous people who are stabbing other inmates or who have attacked guards. And no, isolation is for people who break minor rules. It's a way of maintaining order and of mind control. And so there are people in isolation who haven't, and there are people in this country who've been in isolation way more than Darryl Hunt was for years and years and years. And yes, the UN calls it torture.
Yeah, and then many of those people are discharged to society, and so told like, hey, okay, go and succeed. You can't get a job, you can't get health benefits, you can't get a student loan, you can't, be part of the military. Like, how do people succeed? Can't vote, right? It's kind of mind-boggling. One of the questions when you and I did a preparation earlier this week, I asked you, how did writing this book change you? Because it obviously has.
Yeah, I think it made me, well, first of all, it changed the way I saw Darryl Hunt's case completely. So when I first wrote about him for the newspaper, I was really focused on his case. And then to write this book, I became focused on the man and the person. And to sustain the story for this long, I really had to do my best to put myself in his shoes. So I don't claim that I completely succeeded. Nobody can recreate somebody else's lived experience. But I spent, it took me 6 months to write the first draft of this book. I spent those 6 months trying to imagine through his words, through the prison visits I made, through interviews, what it would have felt like to be Darryl Hunt in those moments, what it would feel like to know you didn't rape this woman and hear a judge convict you. So, and that experience of trying to live or imagine what it would feel like to have been him really opened my eyes to what it would feel like to be imprisoned in one of our prisons in North Carolina. And I think it made me way more compassionate or empathetic, I think is a better word, towards people who have criminal records. And I also spent time with some of his friends who were not innocent of the crimes they'd been convicted of. They had committed some pretty bad crimes. But I really wanted to spend time with them to get, again, the feeling of what he was like with his friends, away from all of his supporters, away from the lawyers who fought for him, away from
notoriety,
just what it would be like to, drive around town, shooting the shit, chopping it up. And so that gave me just so much more empathy for people who have been trapped by this carceral state that we live in. I don't even think I would have felt comfortable using the word carceral state. And now it just, I'm repeating myself, but I just have so much more empathy. And I think I have a lot more empathy for people who struggle with substance abuse.
Yeah. We are way over. There is a couple questions here. One of the questions was there accountability or justice served for the justice to judges and prosecutors who were involved?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I get it. I've now done a number of book events and I get that every single time. And the quick answer is no. So the longer version is that the original police officer was demoted and a couple of his supervisors were reprimanded. But basically the original detective just bore the brunt of, he became the scapegoat for the police department. And as far, the original prosecutor was not reelected. So that is one way to hold prosecutors accountable. We can vote them in or out every 4 years. So, but he then went on to a pretty successful criminal defense practice. Another prosecutor from the second trial ended up in the North Carolina Attorney General's office and retired from there fairly recently. So the answer is no. Prosecutors are immune from being sued, and police, it's really hard to sue police officers. So there was very limited accountability. A little bit more, I mean, there have been reforms now in the way investigations are conducted all around the state, and that's to some extent by cities to try to limit their liability. But there is no real accountability. And as for judges, all those judges who kept saying, oh no, this DNA evidence, no jury would really care about that. There's no accountability for misjudgment or for poor judgment or for misunderstanding what a case is really about. That's except judges are elected too, but most of us don't pay close enough attention to judicial elections or to local elections to really have an effect on the conduct of these officials.
So we're way over. I have one quick question. What, maybe sort of like, that impulse to end on a positive note, but what have been some of the sort of sequelae of this entire case? We have an innocence commission. Like what were some of the legacies of Darryl?
Yeah, so, and the thing that always astonishes me when I start thinking about the pressures and pain Darryl Hunt was experiencing when he got out of prison is also his fortitude to continue on with this advocacy work and the accomplishments he had. So we have an Innocence Inquiry Commission. His case also led to the passage of the Racial Justice Act, which was eventually repealed, but it still is in effect for people who were sentenced to death prior to its repeal. And what the Racial Justice Act did is it allowed people on death row to appeal their sentence, not their conviction, if they can show racism in their sentencing. And pretty much everybody on death row has one of these appeals working its way through the courts. So partly because of Darryl Hunt, we have not had an execution in North Carolina in many years, I think since 2007, but it might be a little earlier or later. And that's because of this Racial Justice Act. In many police departments, they now videotape interrogations. So that's to prevent coercive interrogation. Many police departments now do a much better job at showing witnesses lineup, photo spreads. And so that's to prevent or to guard against false or mistaken eyewitness identification. I think because of Darryl Hunt's case and so many others like it, jurors are more skeptical of police testimony, so that there's a little bit more of a balance in the courtroom. But we still have these cases, and the state still hangs on to this notion of finality, and prosecutors are still defending cases where there is ample evidence of innocence. And there was one in Winston-Salem just recently where there was so much evidence of innocence, and the prosecutor clung to this notion of finality, that finality is more important than getting it right. Yeah, you talked about that across the nation. You tallied up, or someone has tallied up, that there are exonerees who have spent more than in total 30,000 hours, or 30,000 years, excuse me, years incarcerated for crimes they didn't commit. But, listen, it's 9:16. We purport to make this quick and early in the morning. You and I we talked about this the other day for an hour. We could just keep talking about this because it is such a fascinating topic. This is the book. It's Beyond Innocence, The Life Sentence of Darryl Hunt.
and by Phoebe Zerwick. And I want to thank you, Phoebe, for taking time to talk to us this morning on Healthcare Half Hour. It's a monthly conversation that we have here at North Carolina Health News on topics that we're writing about. And just so folks know, we are the only outlet in the state that does have someone who thinks about prison health. So, and in particular, the reason why we do that is because mental health is such a large part of the prison experience in North Carolina. So anyway, thank you so much, folks, for tuning in this morning. And we look forward to what we'll be doing next month. Stay tuned to North Carolina Health News, and we'll announce that in a week or so. So